This interview has been made possible by the View Conference. I'm your host, Jerry Orrs from Kids First, and right now we are with Peter Ramsey. He's an animation director known for Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, Rise of the Guardians, and before that, he was a second unit director as well as a storyboard artist. Peter, thank you so much for being here today.
It's my pleasure, Jerry. Thanks for having me, man.
Absolutely. So like I mentioned in the intro, your career before going to animation directing including storyboard art. And what I find really fascinating is that you did both live action and animation storyboard art. So can you talk a little bit about the transition from being a storyboard artist on major motion pictures like Fight Club, Independence Day, and so many more, into doing animation directing?
Sure, yeah. It's funny. When I first started in animation, the thing that surprised me was how there are a lot of differences in the techniques and the ways you go about doing animation boards versus live action. But the thing that kind of surprised me was how similar they ended up being anyway, because it's all about storytelling, and there's the same rules apply, whether it's, little talking animated animals or whether it's, Brad Pitt and and whoever, but the things that allowed me, I think, to make a transition were just the ingrained habits of visualizing, staging, and the editorial process that you kind of go through in your mind as a storyboard artist. Even though you're not literally like staging things in real life, you're always thinking about what shot is going to cut to the next shot, or you're kind of like, you have to think about the practicalities of how you're going to achieve some of those shots when you're working in live action. So a lot of those things sort of lent themselves just to be able to think about things in visual detail, visual storytelling, or really important things. A really important thing, telling a story economically with as few shots or as few images as you need. And that's a big deal in any medium, but in animation in particular, it really helps focus the storytelling.
That's fascinating. I never considered the economic part of a storyboard artist's job, because always to me, their job was to visually tell the story. I never considered that they also have to think of the economics. It just makes the job even more complicated because it's a combination of director, because you have to worry about blocking, cinematographer, you have to worry about composition, editing, like you said, and I find it amazing that you're able to transition. And your next role, second unit directing. Now, for the audience who doesn't know, second unit directing basically means you are directing things that do not require the main crew, the main cast, things like pickup shots, environment establishment shots, things like that. So how do you think the experience of doing second unit directing prepared you to eventually be doing main unit directing, I guess you can say, for animation?
Mm-hmm. I think it was learning to work with a crew, and learning how to communicate in the moment with a crew is very important. Making sure that the vision that you have in your head is clear and again, achievable, that it's something people can actually do. So all those skills that you pick up from actually working on a movie set give you a kind of, confidence in the moment that you can come up with a plan and that you can direct people in order to execute it. And really, it's the second unit stuff, as you said, it's stuff that the main unit's not doing. So it's usually not, you're not doing a lot of heavy dramatic stuff, and you're not, so sometimes there'll be stunts or effects shots that are kind of intricate in what you have to achieve. But it's, I think as a training ground for me, it was most useful as getting used to the idea of being a director, getting used to the idea of being the guy who, when you say something, it has a little weight. So it makes you think a little more about what you're saying and the decisions that you make.
I find the director role very interesting, especially compared to storyboard art, because, it's still visual storytelling. It's still leading the scene, just in a very different way. So in your own opinion, what do you think are some very important skills that make good directors, either animation or live action?
The main job, as I've, stumbled into discovering years and years and years later, the main job of the director is really knowing the story. Every decision that gets made on a set has to do with the most effective way to tell the story, whether that's through the performances, whether that's through the compositions, whether that's through the staging, the actual blocking that the actors are doing. It could also be through art direction or through wardrobe or through lighting. All of those things require that somebody on that set has to be able to answer fundamental questions about the story, so that you're not telling one story in a way that you really should be telling another story in. You know what I mean? So it's and I'm still a student. I'm still learning. I don't want to sound like I'm some great guru of directing, because that's certainly not true. But the having some sort of creative vision, and then creating an atmosphere where you can get everyone to buy into it and move in that same direction is probably the most important part of the job, the actual doing of the job. you know People have to know what it is they're ultimately trying to achieve, and you have to be the one that can say, well, this fits but that doesn't fit, and that's a good idea but it's a little off target for what we're trying to do, and let me tell you why. So that you can enlist people as collaborators with you and get the best out of them, instead of just somebody shouting orders, and people are running around like little robots who don't really understand what the ultimate goal is. A director kind of marshals all that together to get everybody moving in the same direction.
I think you make some really good points about what the director is. And what I find really interesting is on Spider-Verse, there are 3 directors. You're one of 3 directors. And I find that so fascinating because when you watch the film, it's a very cohesive film. It doesn't run into any of the issues you're talking about. There's a very clear style that transforms as the movie goes forward. Everyone who worked on the film clearly understands what that style is, how it relates to the story, and what the story is itself. So can you talk a little bit about your experience of working in a trio of directors?
Yeah, I mean, it worked because we all bought into the same vision. It was a collective that understood the thing that we were all trying to achieve together, and it was the same goal. I mean, sometimes there would be different ways that we'd have of trying to get there. There were debates about well, what's the best way to achieve X, Y, or Z, but we always knew that at the end of the day it had to fulfill certain things about the vision that we had from the movie very early on. And with Spider-Verse, Phil Lord and Chris Miller really early on had written they had written a treatment, and that they had also written a little statement, like a statement of principles, what they wanted the movie to ultimately be about, and what they wanted it to feel like. And those things that were kind of baked into that original vision that all of us saw at first really formed like the core of what we were trying to do all the time that we worked on the movie. So having a North Star to go to it's a super important thing.
It definitely seems like it. Now, let's talk a little bit more about Spider-Verse. For anyone who hasn't watched it, and if you haven't watched it, watch the film. It is an amazing animated film. I mean, it won Academy Award for Best Animated Film for a reason. It's really good. But if you watch it, the animation style is extremely unique. I mean, you've seen that style in a lot of indie animated films, but in a big production animated film from a big company about a superhero, you haven't seen that before. It's amazing how much you guys were able to achieve. Now, during that process, were you ever terrified or scared or even concerned just a little bit that it wouldn't work and that the style would get a little bit too much and get in the way of the story?
That was something that we were always concerned about, or something that we were determined not to let happen. I'll put it that way. I mean, we really tried to make sure that when we were doing something that was, stylistically, crazy or wild or weird, that it had some sort of connection to the story or the theme in some way, shape, or form. What we wanted to do most of all was express the ideas and the emotions of the characters visually. Of course, we had the aspiration to make the film really visually unique, but we didn't want to do that just because. The question was always, how does this express what Miles is feeling in this moment? Or how does this express the idea of multiple universes? So that there was it, like I said, it goes back to knowing your story. We'd always kind of have to reel it back to, what's the story point we're trying to express here? How far can we go with it without losing the audience. So we were always trying to find a balance, and it was always rooted in story or character or theme.
Hmm. And I think that really helped. I still remember watching the very first trailer that released, the very first just snippet of animation, and watching the train go by miles, the subway, excuse me, go by miles. I instantly loved it, and I instantly want to see it so much. And the entire film is like that, which I find absolutely extraordinary. Now, going on the more organizational side of the job of directing, animation is a complex medium, especially when you're combining a lot of different forms of animation like you did in Spider-Verse. So can you talk a little bit about the day-to-day of being an animator on a very, very complex machine that is an animation film?
Yeah, sure. That's one area where having three directors really helped, because the interesting thing about animation is that you get to a certain point in the process, and there are several different phases of production going on at the same time. It's like when you're shooting live action, you have pre-production where you're planning how you're going to do everything. Then you're in production and you're shooting the movie, and you've got the actors on the sets, and every day you go out and you shoot whatever you have to shoot. Then you move into the next phase, which is editing, and you edit to get a cut of the movie. And then you're working on sound, and then so things kind of happen in phases. In animation, all those phases are typically happening at the same time to some degree. As you move along in production, there's as more scenes get put into what we call the pipeline. It's like a conveyor belt, and you've got people lighting shots at the same time as you have people still animating shots at the same time as you still have people storyboarding scenes. And so there's so many things happening at the same time that it has become a little bit of industry standard for there to be more than one director on a movie, because two brains or three brains are what you need to do a massive job like that. On our movie, the day-to-day would see any one of us doing kind of whatever job needed to be done. And we all had Bob Persichetti, Rodney Rothman, and myself. Like, we all had brought our own particular skills to the job. My main thing is story art. I came out of being a storyboard artist, and that was really mostly what I did in animation. So a lot of times there would be sequences that required some more attention in story than our story team had time for, or some more conceptualizing in story that had to be done, and I would jump off and do that. Bob was trained as an animator by Glenn Keane back at Disney. So he's the technical animation challenges of the movie made him the point man on directing the animation. And Rodney had written, had helped kind of wrangle the script into shape. He's a comedy writer, so he was doing a lot of comedy punch up and a lot of writing that needed to be done on the fly. But at the same time, all of us would be in the editorial room. We'd all be, debating the latest cuts and working with the editors, making changes. We would all record the actors. We were all meeting with the art department and giving notes on, more color, less color. What about this? What about that? So all those other aspects of the film that directors usually deal with, we would all deal with them together. But as I said, the thing that tied it together was still the vision.
And I think all great films have that in common. Excuse me. They have a vision that they're driving towards, and I really think that shows in Spider-Verse. And by the way, for our audience, if you're interested in lighting animation, we just did an interview with Sharon Callahan. She is the director of photography from Pixar. We talk a lot about lighting in that interview, so make sure to check that out. But going back to Spider-Verse, I want to talk a little bit more about where Spider-Verse is in the canon of superheroes. Because, these are characters that already existed. Miles already existed. Peter Parker of Spider-Man already existed. These are all characters that we took inspiration from other works, which also meant that in the storytelling, we were slightly more restricted because you had to match the previous canon. So can you talk a little bit about working in a broader canon and having to be careful not breaking some long character arc that was introduced in the comics?
Yeah, it's interesting. We were freed up from that to an extent by the device of the multiverse. And we did try to be as faithful as we could to, the actual stories from the comics. But, when we introduced somebody like Peter B. Parker he's a pretty radical departure from what you've seen in the comics. But again, we once you have the device of multiple universes, you open the door to all kinds of different things you can do. And the thing that we didn't want to do was something that violated the essence of Spider-Man. Even though it might really stretch it, and might really bend it, it might really like mess with what you think a Spider-Man movie is. At the end of the day, the idea was to get to the heart of the concept of Spider-Man, whether it's Miles or Peter or Gwen or whoever, and remind you of why that character is so enduring and so popular. That whole the whole with great power comes great responsibility idea. It's kind of unbeatable, and the thing that I think surprised me a lot about the movie was that even though there was so much attention and thought about the idea of you're introducing a whole new Spider-Man, and everything's so different, and there's all these crazy, wild, wacky Spider-Man, and it's all crazy, but it's still, at the end of the day, it just makes you go back and appreciate the original idea of the character. It just shows me how powerful that was.
You make a really good point because it does fit with the other Spider-Man films. If you compare newer Marvel films and the old trilogy of Spider-Man, it fits very well. It's like it found its home almost, which I find really cool. Now, the other side of this is that Spider-Verse is an animated superhero film, while the rest are live action. Do you think there is something about animation that allows this film to differentiate? Like, for example, the crazy multiverse of all these different characters taking from all these different animation genres, that would be a lot harder to achieve in live action. So what do you think are some of the differences between the genres?
Yeah, I think, I just think, visually and tonally, it allows you a little more latitude to do crazy things, basically, and there are some aspects of superhero movies that, they do a pretty good job in the Marvel movies and some of the other superhero movies of depicting like incredible, unbelievable things, but still tonally, there's like I think the fact that it's animated and stylized to a degree just gives you that much more freedom, and it allows you, I think, to do a slightly different kind of filmmaking that's a little more at least different from the bulk of the superhero movies that have been done. Something that's a little more expressive and a little more somehow internal and personal. The minute you're talking about animation and you're talking about a visual, a representation of reality, and an interpretation of reality, I should say. So you're opening up a lot of possibilities about how you can make people feel about these characters that you just couldn't get in live action. I mean, the big job in live action is, can I make it believable? You just want people to accept it as real. In animation, we kind of get to hurdle past that to an extent and go, okay, everybody knows it's animated, so it's hitting like a different part of your brain. How far can we push that to like make that idea as vivid as possible?
I really love your perspective of animation because for the longest time I saw animation as what had to be believable. It's the one that it had to work a little bit harder for you to understand, these are people we should feel about. These are not just cubes and blocks and spheres. These are characters with emotions. But you're right, especially if you watch older 2D animations, especially from people like Disney, just the way the characters move, it's so much more expressive. It's so much more characterized to their personalities. Now, we are running low on time, but I would love to ask you, what do you think is the ideal path for animation director? Because live action director, that's a very mysterious path. Over almost every single story you hear, he or she jumps into the directing path. Do you think it's the same for animation director?
To an extent, I think it's the same for all directors. I mean, it is kind of a weird job that somebody just decides that for whatever reason they're qualified to do it, and you could be a bad director. There's plenty of bad directors. So part of it is just deciding that you want to do it and be it. And these days, you can make something on your iPhone, and if you've made a film, hey, guess what? You're a director, So, but as far as like working in the industry, for animation directing, there's a lot of different paths. There are people who I think most of the animation directors that I know have come through story like me, because I think it gives you a grounding in both the visual side, and visual storytelling, but also in the just story mechanics, the mechanics of story. And animation story artists are very involved with the actual structuring of scenes and acts, and you have to be able to discuss a movie in terms of story structure if you're a story artist, to know what you're doing. So a lot of directors come out of that process. There are some, not as many, who come out of animation itself. But animation it's such a different craft. It's about like creating moments, and ultimately moments that turn into a whole performance. But I think it draws on different skills, and I think the people that are drawn to it are drawn to something different than somebody who might want to like supervise an entire movie. So it happens, but from what I've seen, it's more rare. You see more writers become animation directors, honestly, than pure animators, because once again, you're talking about structure, you're talking about a whole different kind of way of like a different scale of storytelling, I guess you would say. So there's different paths. All it really takes is the desire to tell stories visually. There's people in visual effects who go into directing because their true love is telling a story. So it's there. I don't think there's any one path, but unless you're willing to really dig in and understand what goes into story, then it's probably not going to work out.
I think that's so well put. And Peter, thank you so much for talking to us all about your experience and all about your career.
Oh, it's my pleasure, man. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. For our audience, make sure to check out Peter's films, Rise of the Guardians and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. They are available to rent and buy. They are such amazing films. Check them out. This interview is made possible by the View Conference. The View Conference is a yearly CG event that happens both online and in person in Italy. It is happening between October 18th and October 23rd. For information about events like these and how you can get tickets, go to ViewConference.It. I'm your host, Jerry Orris from Kids First. Bye!